Hi, everyone. My name is Dan DeMers. I'm here with Dave McComb. Welcome to the session. Today, we're going to be covering the disambiguation of data mesh, data fabric, data virtualization, data-centric, data lakehouse, data-driven, and actually a few other terms and concepts as well. Just to quickly introduce ourselves. So I'm Dan. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Cinchy, and I'm also the president of a not-for-profit called the Data Collaboration Alliance, which is driving advocacy and awareness of the need for people to have control over their data by managing data through access, not copies. Again, I'm joined by Dave. Dave, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Dave McComb. I'm president and co-founder of Semantic Arts. We're a professional services firm started in the year 2000 that does nothing but 100% of our work is helping firms transition to becoming data-centric. We also launched the Data-Centric Manifesto, which you can find out there on the web and go sign it, and I've written a couple of books on the topic, and I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Dave. So before we get into the disambiguation, why do we even have these concepts? Like, what is the actual origins of it? Well, people have been talking about this idea of becoming data-driven now for many decades. I remember that when I was just starting my career, hearing that. Data-driven is interesting because you want to be informed by the data. But if you really take a step back and look at how intelligence works in nature, it doesn't work where like people, for example, are not inherently data-driven. There's a reason why we all have separate brains. We have autonomy. It's not driven by data. What you really want is to be driven by intelligence. So there's a growing realization that the data is important, but you don't want the data to tell you what to do. You want the intelligence, which is the interpretation of that data, to tell you what to do. And if you look at how intelligence works in nature, it uses what's called a collaborative intelligence, which is very different than collective intelligence, i.e. data-driven, similar to the Borg, if you ever watched Star Trek. So the reason that there is this continuous evolution of technology and the advancement is this is what people are ultimately striving for, is to have the intelligent enterprise. So that's kind of the catalyst behind this continuous onslaught of change.
Yeah, so I'm sort of convinced that there is a factory somewhere that's just churning out buzzwords like these, and you know, everybody's seen them all: meshes and fabrics and integration. In fact, just before this started, I went back to grab a cup of coffee and I just glanced at my bookshelf and came across this gem I'd forgotten was out there. Dave Hay wrote a book called Achieving Buzzword Compliance. I mean, that's it in a nutshell, isn't it? These are all buzzwords.
Yes. That's not a new phenomenon. Like, if you go back even to the Cold War, there's the propaganda was originally created by governments to influence the opinions of societies, and so like this is some propaganda from the U.S. government to U.S. citizens, and then here's the Russian government to Russian citizens, and you know, which side is right? Are they both right? Are they both wrong? Is it like, what is the reality? Well, propaganda works. It's highly effective, and what's happened over the past few decades is that capability has really been weaponized by vendors. So that is really what's driving the onslaught of the terms, anyways, and the concepts, and that's really why we're holding this session, which is to try and sift through the propaganda and like, what are the concepts? When would you use them? What is the good? What is the bad about that? And try and achieve a normalized understanding of these, because there's so much confusion. I've seen that through my entire career.
And you know, being semanticists, one of the big things we want to get into is disambiguation. In other words, you know, if things are ambiguous, if it's not clear what the distinctions are between two things, we want to spend time and say, okay, what separates these two concepts from each other? And what's interesting, while we talk about these things being buzzwords and the whole industry of this, there actually is a germ of truth in every one of these things. And Dan and I are going to try and sift through it and say, what was good about this little movement and the words they attach to it, and what does it mean, and how is it different? So that's where we're going.
Yeah, so it's not as if these evolutions are inherently evil.
Right.
All right, so let's jump in with the first one. So data silos. So this is obviously before there was ever any attempt to consolidate, but what even predated data silos, it was manual processes and the digitization of processes to create, quotes, an app for everything, where there's a database for every app. This was impactful because it allowed the digitization of manual processes and the enablement of capabilities that are not possible in a manual world.
Yeah, it's like when the first business application was a payroll system at the General Electric Sylvania plant in somewhere in Ohio, I think. And they didn't sit down and say, gee, we just created a silo. They built a payroll system and they thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And then, other people did that. And then somebody had an inventory system and then they had an order taking system. And they were, happy as could be until one day they wake up and go, yeah, actually, there's a lot of similar data in these things that we invented independently. Yeah. And that's the beginning of what's next.
Yeah. And even initially it was to support the process automation, but then you get into, well, hey, there's data, I can run queries, I could build a report, but you have this fog of war because you're limited to the data inside of the application. You can build a report off of that. It could be in the form of a screen or an output report or an extract. But people started to then realize that those reports and insights are actually valuable. So data, in fact, has value beyond the fact that it automates the process. I can inspect it, I can understand, I can learn, I can extract intelligence from that. But because it's the report is always in the context of the silo, it's very limited. So the only workaround without introducing the next was that you would do additional integration, which is those red lines on the left. So you would essentially copies of data through ETLs, older APIs like non-REST, and to basically move copies of data to support not only the operational process, but the ability to do the reports. And that's very inefficient and doesn't scale, hence the next evolution there.
And before we even get to that, just one last thing.
Yeah.
The other thing that was going on there in the red lines is what people used to call Swivel Net, where you'd sit in a chair and swivel from one screen to another and just read something from one screen, swivel over and read something from another. It's a human in the brain integration of things that should have been integrated but weren't. So
yeah. So along came the warehouse. Initially, and there's two variations of this that we'll cover. There's the top-down variant, and then there's the bottoms-up, which basically just flips the role of the warehouse versus the data marts. But here it's trying to solve not the integration challenge in terms of enabling the apps to work where they need to reference each other's data. This wasn't to stand in between operational processes. It was really to enable that visibility and intelligence to go beyond the scope of a single silo and to create that more holistic view to get additional intelligence out of the knowledge contained within the data. So Dave, in your experience, what are some of the challenges and how did this help?
Well, it started off so well. Inman and Kimball each, proclaimed that we should have these conform dimensions sorry about that, sorry.
No worries.
Conform dimensions. I'm just going to unplug this thing just in case, because a lot of times these people are that insistent. Because they're recognizing that these themes showed up in all these legacy apps. That our sales rolled up against a geographic hierarchy and a product hierarchy and an organizational hierarchy and all these kind of things. And they said, let's have those conform dimensions. Let's have a small number of facts, and let's bring the facts from all the different systems and put them together and snap them to these conform dimensions. Brilliant idea. But I think what actually happened over time is the workload just got greater and greater, and the ability for people to actually do that conforming to a small number of dimensions kept eroding. And nowadays, we went into a client who said, they did some analysis of their warehouses and said, gee, we discovered that we have patient, this is a healthcare, we have patient data in 6,000 tables. I went, oh my God, you're never going to know what's happening to your patients if you have, and this is the summary data. You go, whoa. Anyway, so it was a good idea that kind of has run its course, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges there was the if apps were finished, they were stable. You were never to change them. You would never add a new one. You would never consolidate two into one or decommission one. If it was fixed and finite and rigid, then in theory you could start the modeling exercise and finish it and be done with it. But you're chasing your tail because those apps are continuously evolving. Individual apps are expanding. Apps are going away. New ones are appearing. And like over time, clearly the trend is more apps, not less. Like that's why a bank, for example, will have 10,000 apps today, and that number continues to grow with, especially the proliferation of SaaS. So that's just an unstoppable force. So you're hitting a moving target. How do you create a single holistic view of all of your company's knowledge when the foundation is highly dynamic and highly adaptive? It's and I think that's one of the challenges here. And then the other that I've seen people struggle with is, well, who owns the model? How do you achieve governance of that? And I think part of that was why there was the split between the top down and it's going to go ahead to the bottoms up, where, you know, in the top down, it's create the enterprise model, and then you create the marts to serve specific reporting needs. Create the enterprise view as step one, whereas here it's create the business line views first. So use that as your summary, and then summarize the summaries into the enterprise model, because essentially you're kicking the can down the road a little bit. You're deferring the enterprise normalization of that model, hence the introduction of this approach.
You know, and the other thing I don't think anybody saw coming, and you kind of alluded to it just then, Dan, is that, you know, you put all this data in the center place, which is sort of data centric, right? Yep. But there's no possibility to build an app on the data warehouse. You can't build a transactional app there, right. So it becomes even more dependent on this upstream thing, and it's kind of ossifying the whole. You know, it's just baking it in to where it's like you're never going to escape this now.
Right, because it actually compounds the integration challenge. Because if so let's say I have just the yellow, the red, and the green app, and then I'm adding the blue one. Well, if I didn't have a warehouse, be it top down or bottoms up, and let's say I didn't see value in having any consolidated view, I can add my app and I could build my 3 integrations and be done with that. But regardless if I have top down or bottoms up, well, I'm now adding a 4th integration. So the integration tax, it gets higher, not lower, on the change of applications, whether I'm expanding functionality, contracting functionality, consolidating, or adding completely new applications, because it's just continuous silos. So you're trying to organize all that, which is a moving target, and the ability to move that target is now further constrained and impeded. So it's a trade-off of slowness of IT change, which, you know, in a world where you're trying to deliver business capability to your customers and drive better customer experiences, that is technology change. That is the enabler behind all of that. So you're trading off between slowing that down versus the benefits, or at least the theoretical benefits, of getting visibility and extracting intelligence out of a connected view of that data. And you know, that's a tough choice to make. I know, like I spent a good 15 years working in financial services at some pretty big banks, and the fact that half of the IT change budget is spent on integration and the byproducts of integration. And I saw as technology was advancing that percentage wasn't going down. In fact, it was largely going up. And you know, at some point, that integration tax is it going to be 100%, where you don't add any new capability, you literally just do integration? It's I don't know where it stops with the.
Well, at the current rate, it's going to be 120%.
Right, there you go. Yes, 10-hour days just to make sure you get all the integration done.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so that was the warehouse, and that stuck around. Now, and again, it's not that these were inherently evil or flawed. It did actually enable you to have holistic views of data, even if it didn't get 100% of that. You were able to do things that you weren't able to do in a world that was purely siloed. So each one is evolutionary. It's solving the problem at hand, and that's, I think, one of the themes here as we go from kind of side to side or slide to slide, is each one is solving a problem, and it does a good job of solving the problem, but it doesn't solve all the problems. And you solve one and it reveals another. That's, I think, what's really happening. Is people weren't trying to create, an integration challenge. That was not the intent. So the next evolution there was, well, essentially the virtualized warehouse, the idea of virtualization. So the icon there has little VR goggles, because it's essentially enabling the reports and analytics and really any visibility into that data or interpretation of that data to be done without having to physicalize, if that's even a word, the data in an organized representation. So you still need to organize it to meet the reporting needs, but you don't have to do it all in one shot. There's no kind of master central model that's doing integration and copies of that. You're still mapping it, but so Dave, in your experience, what were some of the challenges and strengths of virtualization? I think it was about 2006.
The first breakthrough here, and it was very implied that to get a common view, you had to co-locate data. And we're going to see this theme come back and forth. Do you really need to co-locate it, or do you just need to have shared meaning? So that, data virtualization said, maybe co-location isn't the answer. Maybe let's just leave it where it is, and let's have this view onto it. But I think that where the problem arose, and it's almost the identical problem that service-oriented architecture had, which we didn't put in this deck, but is that at one level, if you really had an elegant model and had really good maps, this might work. There's some latency, because you've now got the worst case of all the response times of all the systems you're hitting. But let's say you could put up with latency. That'd be pretty good. But what actually happened was people took the APIs that already existed on their apps and said, go ahead and consume this. That's what they did with service-oriented architecture. It could have worked if you'd had conformed messages and a single model for the enterprise, but instead everybody just said, here's my API, you consume it. And it's I don't know, it's a mixed bag, I think.
Right, for sure. And again, the left side continues to be a moving target in this model as well. So the models are evolving, although people learn early in their careers that you just don't go and change models because it breaks code. So you put all these contracts and layers of abstraction, which adds all this additional overhead. But regardless of that, you're ultimately making changes, sometimes breaking changes. You're shutting down apps, you're adding new apps, so you got to maintain those mappings, and just because of the performance considerations, you're not going to use this to eliminate the integration. And actually, Dave, you brought up an interesting point that we don't have kind of the code evolution in these slides, because it's more centered around just the data, because I'd almost see that as a separate plane altogether, because there's the evolution of code, monolithic to distributed, where you have libraries versus APIs and all of that. It's almost like that would be an interesting view to even overlay with this, the evolution of code.
Microservices, exactly. Yeah.
But I think the one thing that's very relevant from a data perspective is the trend on the code evolution is smaller, more single-purposed blocks of code that can be deployed independently, that can be owned independently. Like you can look at domain-driven design and establishing ownership and governance kind of around kind of business boundaries, and behind all the code is still data. So it's the more focused your application code base is, in theory, actually, in fact, in practice, the more silos you actually have. Whereas if you had just a single giant monolithic code base, which would be catastrophic, of course, we know that. But from a data perspective, then outside of who owns the model, you don't have to do integration. Just join all the data, assuming you have a platform that can scale to that. But it is interesting how there's kind of this back and forth and this relationship between the code and the data. Okay, so that was virtualization. Any other thoughts on virtualization?
I think that's good.
Okay. All right. The next is my favorite. I remember so much confusion and hype in the early days of the data lake. But Dave, how would you play it back?
Well, the pendulum swings back, doesn't it? So now we say, oh no, co-location is the answer. If we could just get all of our data sets in one place, and our data scientists could deal with it. And people were sort of getting tired of there was such delays that were coming along for the ETL. It was now the backlog in most companies was months, if not longer. So people said, well, let's not bother with all that conformance, put it in the data lake. And besides, we have all this external data now that didn't even come from our own legacy system. We're just harvesting off the web and clickstream and all this stuff. Put that all in there and we'll figure it out later.
Yeah, figure it out later. Yeah, so my view is very similar. Is the ETL was a huge drain in terms of the challenges of building that warehouse, because there's like, how do I get the data in, and then how do I represent that data, which is the whole governance question. But even how do I get the data in? Well, extracting data is not mission impossible. Loading data is not, but it's the transformation that can be very hard, because that's where it forces you to have that, left side. Okay, the left side is the way it's modeled inside of the system. Well, first of all, do we even understand how it's modeled? And then the right side, well, how should we model it? That's the hard part. And then there's the technical work of actually, mapping it and transforming it, and doing that without any data loss and maintaining lineage and all these other challenges. So it's very slow. So people are hungry to get the intelligence. They have all the data in their apps, but why is it taking so long? So let's swap the order from extract, then transform, and then load, to let's extract, then load, and then we'll transform. we'll transform later. We'll kick the can down the road, which again it's not that that's bad, because what it does is it decouples it, right? Because you could, in theory, have, and I saw organizations do this, where they would have teams that were literally just there to hydrate the lake, get as much data in, both internal and external, and don't worry so much about the organization of that. That's someone else's problem. And then you have separate teams that are trying to then figure out what to do with that data. I think one of the challenges here was that there was so much hype in the early days when people were building this, and so much confusion, where I saw, very senior leaders who were not fully understanding that this is not going to be the panacea that's going to solve all their data challenges. It does nothing to eliminate integration. It does nothing to facilitate the organization of this data. So it is a step in that journey, but it is not going to deliver the massive ROI that people were talking about in the early days. Now people realize that, but there was so much confusion here. It was crazy. Anything else on the
data swamp lake?
Yeah.
Nope.
All right. And then what I think people realize, I'm actually going to go back for 1 second here. And I also realized I should have put red lines here instead of the dotted lines here, because that's getting copies of the data. It's not just a virtual view of that. Okay, so I need to do something with this. Well, ultimately what I need to do is basically create a warehouse off of that, an organized representation. Do I do bottoms down, top down versus bottoms up? It's the same question. Or do I do virtualization? So the lake house is really the introduction of a unifying approach, where you have essentially different zones. You got your raw, and you've got your different curation zones with different levels of data quality to facilitate basically the pipeline of the organization, the collection, the organization, and curation and interpretation of all of that data. It's really taking the lake and a warehouse and having some level of consistency between those technology platforms. But it also sounds a lot cooler than reintroducing a warehouse, which at the time was considered old-fashioned and already having proven to fail. But lake houses sound cool.
Yeah, and there's some economy here, because now the data warehouse only has one style of access it has to deal with. It's just accessing the lake. It's a well-known thing, whereas previously, however many technologies you had in your stack was how many ways you had to go at it. Yep. So some net gain there for sure.
For sure, yeah. All right. And then fairly recently is the data fabric, which is a term that has existed for a while, but it's reached this peak hype like late last year. It was on literally the peak of the hype cycle on Gartner, and you can see all the industry analysts talking about it. But if you ask 10 people what a data fabric is, you'll get 15 different answers of that. And I'm saying this, and we are a company that sells a data fabric. But what is a data fabric? Well, what do you want it to be? That's kind of how it is today, which is reminds me again of the early days of the data lake. So it will settle down on a definition of that. So this may be controversial to people because people have different understandings of that. But the way that I interpret it, anyways, and this is what I see as kind of the convergence of this is it's essentially the network-based architecture to information management. So it's a unified solution approach for integration. So it's not necessarily solving the analytical side, but it's solving the creating a connected fabric of data. So like the term fabric, just think of a fabric where you have threads that you're weaving together. So the data fabric is like the loom that facilitates the interwoven view of data. So I almost see this as a little bit of the maturation of master data management, whereas master data management is creating the interwoven view of a single data set, like customer or employee, but then having not only that, but have those interwoven data sets further interwoven to create that network-based approach. And we're still in the kind of the peak of the hype cycle here. There's a lot of conversations about it, a lot of confusion about that, and a lot of fake news about that, like everything. But this is what this is doing, I think, is starting to recognize that the integration on the left side, because if we go back to the other ones, we're very centered around the right side, like how to get the intelligence out. But a lot of companies didn't realize that this side is what is consuming a ridiculous amount of cost and complexity, where it's growing. With every new app is a new silo, and every new silo is new integrations, and that tax is what is that burden that limits agility. So I think this is where people are starting to realize that you got to look at this a little bit more holistically than just how do I get my data together at the end of it all. It's how do I make it so that it is together when I'm creating technologies.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There is a lot of hype to it. We're working with a client who's implementing a data fabric, and we're helping them. But we're at the level of doing JIRA tickets without literally understanding, and I'm not sure they completely understand exactly what they're doing. But there's a couple of components here, though. There's a level of indirection. It's not quite full-on virtualization, but it kind of is. We're trying to get both consuming apps and producing apps to speak a common language, and that is the language of the fabric. So I think that's a step in the right direction in general. I don't think there's a lot of organizing principle around it yet, though. Yeah,
and actually, as you say that, it makes me think that it is not only is this a kind of an evolution of master data management, that maybe we even should have had that as a slide there, as it is a step in the life cycle, but. So there's elements of data mastering here to create that unified interwoven view, but there is elements of virtualization as well, because the virtualization doubles as a layer of insulation of change and abstraction, which is what you're getting here. So perhaps one way to think of it is almost like the unification of those two concepts into a common approach. And again, depending on which analyst you'll talk to, some will say that this is technology, some will say that this is just a way of thinking and operating. But yeah, so that's kind of where we're now kind of in the present ish time, whereas in the prior slides we were kind of more in the past decades. So but the present isn't done yet because the rate of change is ever increasing. So what used to be like a 10, 15, 20 year change cycle is now a 2-year change cycle. So anything else on a data fabric before we move to the next?
I think that's good.
All right. So data mesh, do you want to take this one? Do you want me to take this one?
Sure. Data mesh is getting a lot of traffic now, and I think mostly thanks to ThoughtWorks. They've been doing some great thought leadership as they do, and I think it's an interesting idea. It's sort of taking domain-driven design, which was a programming paradigm, and said, essentially, let's apply that to data. Let's have our data in domains. Let's not run it through the commons and into the IT department, and where it's, people don't understand what things mean anymore. And I think in many ways that is a step in the right direction. Yeah, why don't you take it from there, Dan, and we'll maybe riff back and forth a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I think that the idea that you can have a the centralization of an enterprise-wide model is largely just guaranteed to fail, because there is no one that has the ability to comprehend that level of complexity, especially knowing that not only do systems change, but businesses change as well. So by having the the borders of ownership and autonomy be aligned to the business, this idea of domains, and then managing the data itself as a product within those domains, so that a domain, let's take employees and human resources just as a simple example, managing that with a product mindset is, I think, game changing in terms of establishing ownership and autonomy. It's kind of recognizing that you do want silos, but you want silos not so much that cause integration, but silos that enable autonomy, for the same reason that we have countries that have borders, so that you can have different laws in those countries. But what you want in an ideal world is borders that don't have bodies of water in between, so that you can just freely walk across. And you want passports, and you want the ability to kind of seamlessly move across borders, but respecting that each country has its own autonomy and can control its own destiny, and aligning that ownership based on the actual business reality. So this is still early days. There's lots of big hairy questions, but I do think in my mind, the paradigm of domain-driven design when applied to code, it makes so much sense, and it's been around for a while now, that doing that to data, I think, similarly makes so much sense.
It makes sense, but sort of what you're suggesting there, Dan, is there's still a lot of cross-border activity here. Which domain is customer in? Is it in the ordering domain, the CRM domain, the warranty domain? They're obviously in all those domains, and so how do you manage the crossover? I think is going to become the next challenge.
Yeah, it's how do you manage where even an individual attribute of an entity resides in terms of ownership, and then not only that, you're still delineating. There's still a border between the scope of one data product to another, and what's not shown here is the domains, right? And it's not necessarily one-to-one; it's one-to-many. A domain can have multiple data products within that. But what happens when you want to build a report that spans multiple products within a domain, or span multiple domains? Is well, right now I just put you can do reporting within the context of a single product without needing anything, but if you're doing it across, are you introducing a warehouse? Are you introducing virtualization or a hybrid? So you do still have to solve that problem, because to me, what the mesh is solving for is not the reporting and analytics, not the app building, because here apps still have databases, and regardless if they're doing direct integrations as they used to, or using the data products to facilitate the integration, there's still integration. But what it's solving is governance, right? But it's not like anything. It's not solving everything that all the problems in the world. Anything else on data mesh?
No, I think that's right on. Yep.
All right, let me go to the next one. I think you know a little bit about this one.
Yeah, it's my own personal favorite. So the first go, a lot of these things are buzzwords. We've tried to make this as precise as possible, and what we say is that there is a single, simple, extensible, federatable, and shared model at the center of every enterprise. And what that means, what that does is in almost every case we've seen, there are many hundreds, but less than 1,000 concepts that you really need to share across the enterprise, and that kind of solves the cross-domain problem. And the extensibility bit says, yeah, here's the subdomain specific things, but they're already tied into the centralized bit. And the other bit, and you're going to speak to this, I know, but the other part, we emphasize graph databases because of their flexibility. We emphasize semantics because it's the shared meaning you need to get to, not the shared structures. And finally, model-driven everything, because we want to have as little code as possible to make the whole thing more flexible. But this is right in your wheelhouse too, Dan, so go for it.
Yeah, so like to me, the idea of being data-centric, it's actually fascinating, because I don't think, like if you think back through now history, the code came before data, so digital data, I should say, because the data was always there, even if it was the result of writing pencil on paper. It's but the digitization of data initially was a utility to enable code to remember information, right? So that's where digital data's origins were, but it kind of took a life of its own, and like now, generally what I find is people go through this aha moment where they realize, oh my God, it's almost like people creating machines and then the machines becoming self-aware. Well, the code created the data, and the data becomes self-aware. Like it becomes more than what it was created to be. It is its own. It is the application. Data is the purpose. That's why we created these things. But we had to create the code first in order to recognize that. But it's like the data is moving out of its parents' basement and becoming independent and autonomous. And that's a really big deal. And the reason that that's a big deal is I think there's two parts to it. One is in a data centric, like if we take a puristic view of this, like let's pretend you're building a brand new company and you were able to apply data centricity right from the get-go. Well, in theory, you wouldn't really do integration other than maybe external data. Like you would be extending and refactoring your model as you go and making change to that, but you're not doing integration. The other is the fact that the level of intelligence that you get, because now the data is all connected, you can leverage inference and other capabilities that give you a level of visibility that you would just never get with silos. It's just like how your brain can reorganize itself as you learn through plasticity. So it's unlocking that. But I still think there's huge challenges in data centric because it looks great on paper. But how do I create the model? Who owns it? And how do I govern it? Right. So I think what do you see in your experience as some of the challenges when organizations are looking to move towards this once they have that aha moment?
Yeah, well, governance is the key thing there. And I just recently saw some material about the knowledge graph maturity model. And sure enough, at levels 3 or 4 is when you finally actually get back around to proper sharing. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to, I guess, start our clients at level 3. But you know, the people that have done this well have done something along the lines of saying, let's create a consortium. Let's create one governance group that's only dealing with the stuff that we really need to share across the entire enterprise, and then have a separate governance group for each, you know, functional subunit. But and they talk to each other, but not. It's not a strict, you know, command and control structure. It's more like the W3C itself or something like that. And that seems to work pretty well.
Right. Yeah. Well, and one thing to note, and tell me if you agree with this, but the idea of being data-centric isn't just looking at it in the lens of you know, analytics and reporting and AI and ML. It's everything. That's how you build operational systems.
The long game, the short game is analytics. Yeah. But the long game is to say you now have a platform where you could little by little start decommissioning your legacy systems. And you know, up to now we've had legacy modernization, which just replaces one legacy system with a neo-legacy system. I mean, that is not progress. But I think here you can start to just carve things off the edge until you can really decommission things.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that I find works well for organizations, especially if you have a long history, is you can start by introducing it for your new builds. So before you start building the conventional approach, you can now think of data and applications as separate things and design accordingly. For your existing systems, well, if they work the way and you were happy with them before, well, don't change it just for the sake of changing it. But as you need to make change, then you can factor this in. So it really, the way to utilize it is to rethink how you implement the changes that you're going to do anyways. and that way it's frictionless versus trying to be disruptive where you're reorganizing your budget and all these other complications. But one of the things that I've noted is like each of these things, they each solve a specific problem. So they're not, you know, you can't just take, it's not about choosing which one do you want. It's so I had this realization a while ago. It reminds me very much of the idea of a Rubiks Cube. If you, this is a video of someone who I think previously had the world record of solving it in like 4-point-something seconds. That's now been broken. I think it's 3.47 seconds. But if you think about that for a second, there's, what is it, 43 quintillion possible combinations in a single cube. If you didn't have a plan of attack, if you're just literally randomly spinning it, you could spend your entire life. You could be born spinning the cube and you could die spinning the cube and never solve it. But generally, unless you're a small child or something, you're going to try and come up with a model here, but you generally get started by trying to figure out how to solve a side. I just want to solve the yellow side, and amazing, I've now solved the yellow side. That's like a big milestone. All right, on to the next side. So now I'm going to solve the red side and fiddle with that for a couple hours, and now I get the red side. But wait a minute, my yellow side is unsolved. It's maybe mostly together, but there's now some fragmentation there. Let me go back and try and fix that. Well, now I break the red side, and okay, let me try blue. Similarly, it's better than complete randomness, but the fact that there's so many combinations, like what you really need to do is actually understand how the cube works and not try to solve the side. You have to try and solve the cube. It's like playing chess, and I think there's a lot to be learned here in trying to solve the data architecture challenge. And how do you solve the cube, not the side? I think this is just so fascinating, because on one hand you can spend your entire life doing this, and on the other hand, if you have the right plan, you can do it in 3 seconds. That's a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've looked at as a kind of an inspiration for this is the idea of data being a network. It's all connected, and most people realize that data is connected, but I don't think people necessarily equate that to a network. Like network science, not really necessarily apply to data, but it's a fairly mature discipline. Like you can look at computer networks, telephone networks. Like there's lots of networks that have evolved, and there's obviously the internet, but even prior to that, just a basic computer network. You have token ring, you've got Ethernet, you've got and these days most people in a home will have a mesh Wi-Fi system where every node, every device talks to every other device, creating that mesh network. And and these have their places, right? But if you think about this being applied to data, it can act as a bit of a muse, a source of inspiration for the way that you kind of target your design. And obviously the internet, aka the network of networks, is a really good example of that. And I think there's so much that we can extract from the learnings there when we think about the future of data architecture, and what do we pull from the mesh versus data centric versus the lake house versus whatnot. And there's a video that I'm gonna share. I think it's
hang on just a second, Dan. Before you start the video, just to go back to your topology, which I think is pretty interesting. I would put forward the idea that in most enterprises, still the predominant topology is the line. That almost everybody has these data pipelines, and it goes from this step to this step to this, and we call it the data bucket brigade. But it's just going in a straight line and getting enhanced along the way. Maybe MDM is a little like the star. We decide to put the master data in the middle and leave the other. So there's some interesting analogies there. But go ahead and see what the end game looks like.
No, but it's interesting actually, and it's not just one line. There's thousands.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And I do wonder if they do close the loop sometimes as well, creating the circular dependency. So this video that I'm going to share is something that you can just access on the internet. I remember the first time I saw it, it kind of blew my mind. So I'm going to play it. Hopefully the audio works well. It's about a minute, so I'm just going to stay quiet and let the audio play for a second. But I think you'll find it interesting if you've not already seen it.
The internet protocol is woven into the fabric of everything we do. If we change this protocol, then we can change society.
Josh, what is this main artery of the information superhighway?
Every business, no matter how large, no matter how small, will be on the internet in the year 2000.
This thing didn't build itself. Millions of people across every culture have been plugging things in, running cables across oceans, installing servers, building data centers, all to make this work.
The web is incredibly exciting because it is the fulfillment of a lot of our dreams. I think that the web is going to be profound in what it does to our society.
The internet is the largest engineering project the Earth has ever seen, and we're just getting started.
So you'll notice that so first of all, I thought that was cool.
Now put it back to your topology. You remember before the internet, not the World Wide Web, but before the internet, everything was mostly a star topology. There was always a center to the network. DECnet and all those things were centered. Then there's some rings, token rings and things like that. But you know, a lot of the internet was, let's just not have a center. There's no point of failure. It's kind of a mesh, I guess. And then you put the World Wide Web on top of it. That's where it really took off.
Yeah, and I think that's where you know, techies will understand the difference between the web and the internet, but not everyone does. So actually, let me go. Hopefully, I go to the right slide here. Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you know, there's hardware somewhere in the world, and then you've got the web, which is of course some form of software. But the web wouldn't have been possible without that thing in the middle, that internet. So the internet is things like the Internet Protocol, TCP and IP and DNS and like all these technologies that then made the World Wide Web as we know it. You know, things like HTTP and you know, the concept of a web browser that renders HTML and things like that now possible. So I kind of think of as the, you know, hardware, of course, is infrastructure, but the internet itself is also infrastructure, and it's used by the web. The web is kind of like the appification of that infrastructure. It's the app on top of the infra. And you would have not had the Facebooks and Twitters and the massive evolution if you didn't have the internet. But imagine if you tried to build the web and you didn't have the internet. Imagine how slow and rigid, brittle, and expensive that would be. That's kind of how we work today in an enterprise context. You've got hardware and then you've got software, but what's the thing in the middle? Well, today you build software and you're worrying about data. How do I integrate data? How do I connect data? How do I model data? How do I protect data? How do I restrict access to data? How do I audit changes? Like this is the responsibility of a business application, but every business application needs these capabilities, right? So it's kind of just begging for the internet equivalent of that. So I came across a term that was from an author of a book that was published in 1987, and the term kind of stuck with me. But this idea of Dataware as this really changing how you think of software, so that the software itself is kind of like the web. It's now focused on the business problem. It's not focused on the data problem. And if I think back to all the times I built applications in a banking context, you know, 60% of my thought process was on the data problem. Imagine if I didn't have to do that. I could solve the business problem with 100% of my mental capacity. It'd be game changing. And I think that's what I think people are starting to realize is it's not about cleaning up after the fact. You know, complicate how you build the software and then figure out how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again after you build the software. It's changing how you build the software. That's what's missing here. And if you think about it, like the need here is that, and it's not about what platform you do. It's more of a way of thinking about it. But ultimately, it needs to be implemented as technology that you can either buy or build, and a combination of these. But what it's doing is it's freeing your apps from the complexities of data, and that I think is the ultimate panacea. Like that is, to me, is the next big shift, is when you can build the app, solve the business problem. When you're designing your own dataware for your organization, don't start from scratch. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. Is we have all this evolution behind us and all these lessons learned. You know, what worked well about data silos? Well, it was fast. And it was digital versus manual. And what worked about a warehouse? Well, consolidation of view and inference and connectivity of data is very powerful to extract insights. And so there's the good and data centricity, like the avoidance of integration and data mesh, the governance, right? So you can pull lessons and concepts and technologies from these various evolutions. So imagine like a solution that is you're thinking data centricity for new applications, using a data fabric for integration to avoid the point-to-point, and using creating a data mesh for the governance angle, and organizing and managing data as products with domain autonomy and all the considerations of that. Because ultimately what the Dataware is doing is it's enabling the collaboration on data in the same way that the web is the collaboration on content. And if you think of Web 1.0 to 2.0, it's highly collaborative. It's bidirectional, and that's I think inevitably that is the future of data. It's collaborative, it's collaboration, bidirectional.
Right on. Amen, brother.
So Dave, from your experience, I know I've heard you say this before, but like, what's the key thing there as you're going about your journey?
Yeah, well, this is how we proceed with clients. For a long time, we thought that just creating the model, the shared model, and designing an architecture was sufficient. We thought that was the hard problem. We gave it to people. Turned out it was shelfware. That wasn't very satisfying. We noticed that other people were making rapid progress with small agile projects, even small agile semantic projects. But we also observed that they were creating semantic silos. So we said, well, there's got to be a better way here. We decided we're going to mentor our clients through the process. So we have this method, we call it Think Big, Start Small, which says do enough of the enterprise ontology work so that you're very confident that whatever domain you start in is kind of future-proof for integration to the rest of the enterprise. And that's pretty much our mantra now, is how do you combine stitching the whole thing together with making some local progress.
Right. Makes a lot of sense to me. All right, so that's the main part. We want to definitely open it up for questions. One thing is for any of you out there who follow us on Cinchy.tv, we are going to be having a session with the COO from Concentra. It's going to be a really fascinating session about how you just don't want to be customer centric. What you actually want is to be everything centric, and everything includes customer, but is not limited because you don't want to solve one side of the cube. But bringing this to life with some real world outcomes, and it's you're going to see some pretty cool things that they've been able to do using a data centric approach. So that's on March 25th, and you can sign up if you go to Cinchy.tv. And Dave, is there anything that you want to plug before we open it up to questions?
No, I think I'll just plug the Data Centric Manifesto. Just type that in and go find it and get some ideas there. But yeah, do we have questions in I don't have the chat here. Do we have hand raising? How do we want to do this?
Yeah, I don't know how it works. I don't see. Okay, no questions as of yet. All right, so I guess I don't know if it's possible for people to ask the question through a chat, or if there are any questions. Okay, so I see the first question there is, what will be the contributing or constraining roles of data governance in all of these trends?
Yeah, our take right now, data governance is mostly just trying to do a combination of two things. One, don't break things that exist. So part of governance is not let people change the metadata over here because that's going to break something. And a lot of it is just being an expert in this subdomain. So we have all these stewards and stuff that they're doing data governance. And those are nice and necessary things. But I think the future is, how can you help a firm grow into a more elegant future? And that kind of governance looks, Dan was calling it collaboration, and that's exactly what it is. It is collaboration. It's not trying to keep things buttoned down the way they are and not broken. It's let's collaborate and co-invent the future.
Yeah, I think for me, the key to successful governance is that it isn't an after the fact attempt to clean up. It's not about governing what to do solely after people break the law, but what are the laws that will make it so that we don't have to put everyone in jail, and establishing those rules of the road so that we can go about living society in a happy, healthy, collaborative way with some guidelines, some constraints that are for the collective benefit. So I think, like, what I've seen when people are setting up governance programs is the house is so dirty that it's very much, how do we clean and organize versus how do we, so they're trying to clean up the company on one side, but then you have the teams that are delivering the business capabilities that are kind of going about their business without any support. It's, if anything, the governance is adding a tax to that. It's not removing barriers. It's not accelerating change. It's slowing. It's saying, now you're going to have to do this. Don't forget to connect into our data catalog, and our it's adding more work. It's not taking away the work. And that's, to me, the realization of where governance adds value is when it adds value to you as a citizen. That's why we have a government, for example.
Yeah, and riffing on that a little bit, I think data governance is the way it is now because of the literal complexity of the datascape. Most clients now have hundreds of thousands, some of them have hundreds of millions of concepts under management. And somebody has to govern all these pieces of metadata and columns and fields and elements and all this metadata repositories and all this stuff. Somebody has to understand that and govern that and stuff. But you say, well, what about, let's posit a world where the whole thing is just a few thousand, that people can literally understand it and embrace it and move it. Then data governance is more about the legacy and the understanding and the moving toward the light.
Yeah. So there's another question around, can this support transactional data? But this is not one thing. This is, so it depends what you're talking about, because like a warehouse was never intended to solve transactional data, whereas say a fabric is generally suited for such. So it depends on which technology and which evolution. But ultimately, I think the one thing that I think about there is that you don't want to be only looking in isolation at one side of the cube. So don't just look at the post-transactional world, and don't just look at the pre-transactional world. You have to look at holistically at it for you to solve the cube.
Right.
Yeah. So there's another question is, what do you think the cost benefit of a data-centric approach is? What is the speed upside, cost savings, employee and client enablement benefits?
There's a lot there. I'll take some of that because the question ahead of that is for you. So you got a nice softball one there. But a lot of the benefit does come from the simplification. If you take a very complex datascape and then have somebody say, I'm going to do AI on this, or I'm going to do machine learning, I'm going to do data science. They spend most of their time trying to figure out what's there, normalizing it, which is the good bits, figuring out all the features, and then you get started. Well, you have a simpler model, that drops those costs a lot. It's taking most of the cost, as Dan was saying, if you take most of the cost of integration out of your equation, that's a huge saver right there. Just being the example I said where you got patient data in 4,000 tables, no human can write a 4,000 table join, and no computer can process it. You're never, ever, ever going to know about your patients. And yet there are companies like Montefiore has done this, where they've got all of their patient data in a single graph. It's all connected. So the benefits are huge, I think.
Right.
But why don't you take is there a Dataware platform?
Yeah, well, so as most of you know, Cinchy is a technology platform that is really attempting to be this eventual platform. But the reality is we don't have all the answers. So there's technology, and then there's the people and process side of it. So I don't think it's realistic for anyone to expect that you're just going to download some software and install it and or access it over a cloud, and boom, all of a sudden you're off to the races. It is very much a paradigm shift. You have to kind of buy into the idea of implementing that separation of data from applications and leveraging data centricity and all of that. To me, that's the first challenge. Like I know when we're talking to, even if it's a prospect, it's not about the technology at first. It's about like, where do you see the evolution of data and applications inside of your organization? Where are you trying to ultimately take that? How do you want to do governance? How do you want to do these things? And then the technology can follow that. But I would say that there is no magic silver bullet, is what I would say is the honest answer of that. And then there's another question there around self-organizing solutions. So deep learning based on concepts evolving out of current AI and ML based data platforms. Dave, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, we've seen some of this. We've seen a lot of hype on it, and we've actually seen some reality. Obviously ML can read text, find concepts and surface them and say, maybe this is your model. But as far as we've gotten, right now we call it speed reading for ontologists. In other words, it can, if you have a reasonable starting model and then turn the ML loose and it finds a bunch of more specific things, you can go, oh yeah, that actually fits in here, that one fits over there. And so I think there's still a human in the loop here, at least for the next few years.
Right. I think one exciting future capability is the concept of active metadata, where the metadata, which is not just business descriptions, it's everything, it's control data, everything, being able to activate that beyond its purpose of understanding the data and extract intelligence and insights out of the metadata itself, and use that to even evolve. Like let's say you're using a fabric, it's almost like defragging the disk and being able to have engines and logic to be able to do that can apply machine learning and AI to, as you're creating a new data set, have recommendations on, well, maybe that data set already exists. So there's kind of a whole new world that opens up when your metadata is together and available as data, which you can then apply these technologies like AI and ML to, that we're just in the early days of this. So it's even hard to imagine what's going to become possible. But I think that's going to be really exciting. But you would never be able to get there if we didn't move towards data centricity, as an example. That's the enabler.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. So I think we're at time.
We are at the top of the hour.
All right. So thank you, Dave, and thanks.
Yeah. Thanks Dan, for setting this up, and thanks audience for giving us the excuse to put these slides together.
Exactly. Definitely come in handy. All right. Excellent.
Great. Take care.
All right.